I never imagined humiliation could arrive wrapped in silk and champagne. There I was, tucked away in the third row at my younger sister's wedding, sporting the only formal dress I owned, trying desperately to fade into a room brimming with people who all seemed a little too polished, a little too perfect. My son Luca, an energetic 8-year-old, sat beside me, his legs swinging beneath the table. He wore a sharp little suit I'd stretched 2 paychecks to afford, and he looked so incredibly proud to be there. He genuinely believed this day would somehow make us feel like part of the family again. Maybe I harbored that same naive hope. Vivian, sister, glided through the day like a bona fide movie star. She always possessed that radiant energy, beautiful, charming, universally adored, especially by our mother. She effortlessly collected all the compliments, while I, her older sister, perpetually received the comparisons. She commanded the spotlight. I learned the quiet art of living in the shadows. Still, I showed up. I smiled. I clapped dutifully when the happy couple kissed. I even managed to keep my voice steady when well-meaning guests, their curiosity thinly veiled, would ask, "And you're the older sister? You don't even look like you have an 8-year-old." Then came the speeches, a seemingly innocent tradition that quickly unraveled into a public spectacle. The groom's best friend went first, delivering a few mildly amusing anecdotes that elicited polite, light laughter. Then it was Vivian's turn. I braced myself expecting something sentimental, perhaps a heartfelt reflection on love, or a nostalgic anecdote about our shared childhood. I even raised my glass in anticipation, a silly gesture of hope. I really should have known better. She lifted her crystal flute, a dazzling smile gracing her lips as she surveyed the room. "I want to thank everyone for coming." She began, her voice sweet and glowing. "It truly means the world to have you all here. And of course I want to say something special about my big sister." I instinctively turned to Luca, offering him a warm, reassuring smile. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with innocent excitement. For a fleeting moment, I actually believed she was about to say something kind. But Vivian continued her tone, shifting a subtle edge creeping into her voice. "Lara's been such a role model. She's a single mom, strong, independent, and clearly unwanted by anyone else." The room, initially quiet, erupted into a cacophony of laughter. My stomach lurched a sickening flip-flop. I thought I must have misheard her, but she kept smiling, as if she'd just delivered the most charming, witty joke imaginable. Some guests looked confused, their brows furrowed, but most laughed harder, clinking their glasses in what felt like a collective endorsement of the good fun. I didn't know where to look. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in my ears. Luca tugged at my sleeve, his small voice a pained whisper. "Why did she say that about you, Mama?" Before I could even formulate a response, my mother, Judith, added loudly from her table without missing a beat. "She's a used product, but hey, she still looks good for her age." More laughter, sharper and crueler this time. It was the kind of laughter that cuts through skin, the kind that lets you know everyone in the room suddenly sees you differently. Not as a guest, not as family, but as entertainment, as an object of pity, as a source of shame. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My face burned with a searing heat, but I stubbornly refused to let the tears fall, not in front of my son, and certainly not in front of them. My fingers curled into my napkin under the table, gripping it so tightly it felt like a lifeline. I desperately scanned the room, searching for someone, anyone who might meet my eyes and offer even a sliver of compassion. My grandfather looked down at his plate, seemingly absorbed in its contents. My cousin smirked at her phone, her attention feigned. Even my uncle, who once told me I reminded him of my late father, didn't bother to look up. Luca. My sweet boy looked utterly lost. His little eyebrows were furrowed in confusion and hurt. That was the part that truly broke me. Not the words, not the laughter, not even the overwhelming shame. It was the crushing realization that my son was witnessing all of this, trying to comprehend why his mother, the woman who kissed his scraped knees, who stayed up late patiently helping him with his math homework, was being mocked and ridiculed by her own family. I wanted to leave. I longed to grab Luca's hand, storm out, and never look back. But something within me hesitated. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to tell them they didn't know half of what I'd carried, what I'd survived. Yet my mouth was dry, my legs trembled uncontrollably under the table. Then, before I could even gather the strength to move, I heard a chair scrape back, a jarring sound in the sudden stillness. Callum, the groom, Vivian's perfect polished fiancé, stood up slowly. He didn't look amused. He didn't even glance at Vivian. He didn't look at the guests. His eyes, intensely focused, went straight to me, and something in his expression made the entire room freeze. In that instant, I knew something significant was about to happen. Not a rescue, not a fight, but a reckoning. People often assume that being the older sibling automatically means you lead the way that you're naturally looked up to. But in our family, I was more of a cautionary tale than a role model. My name is Laura. I'm 34, a single mom, and undeniably the black sheep of the family. I live in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town with my son Luca. He's 8, and without a doubt the best thing that ever happened to me, the sole reason I ever stepped back into rooms that once made me feel so small. I work 2 jobs to make ends meet mornings at a bustling local cafe, nights at the front desk of a small hotel. Life isn't glamorous, but it's mine. I make Luca pancakes every Saturday morning. I know how to expertly sew patches into his worn-out jeans, and he tells me I'm his superhero. That's truly all I need to keep going. However, being a single mom in my family meant I was perpetually labeled as the one who failed. My mother, Judith, made sure I felt it at every holiday dinner, her disapproval a palpable presence. She's obsessed with appearances, which is precisely why she proudly tells everyone that Vivian's wedding is a second chance for the family name. Vivian is 5 years younger than me. She's stunning. Successful always had everything effortlessly handed to her, and always knew how to make it look like she'd earned it. She's the golden child, the one Judith absolutely adores. If Vivian so much as sneezed, our mother would instantly bless her with a silk handkerchief. If I got sick, she'd simply tell me to take vitamins and stop being dramatic. When I got pregnant with Luca, everything irrevocably changed. I was 25, newly in love with a man who swore he'd stand by me. But by month 5, he vanished. No note, no explanation, just gone. My family didn't ask questions. They didn't offer help. Instead, they offered me deafening silence, biting judgment, and a chorus of "I told you so's." But then I had Luca, and when I held him for the first time, every cruel word they'd ever uttered became nothing more than distant, inconsequential white noise. Still deep down, I harbored a flicker of hope that they'd eventually see me not just as a single mom, but as someone worthy of love and respect. Maybe that's why when I received Vivian's elegant wedding invitation, I said yes, even though I wasn't part of the bridal party, even though my name was misspelled on the RSVP card, and even though I had to rent my dress and do my own hair in the cramped bathroom mirror, while Luca practiced his beaming smile and his crisp little tie. I told myself it was for closure, that maybe, just maybe, this was my family's subtle way of extending a quiet olive branch. The wedding that never was. The venue was breathtaking, a symphony of white roses, gold-accented tableware, and the soothing strains of a string quartet playing in the distance. Vivian looked like she belonged on the cover of a bridal magazine. She was all smiles and sparkling eyes, basking in every compliment and camera flash. When she passed me, her smile faltered ever so slightly. "You made it," she said, as if my presence were a surprise. She then glanced down at Luca and added, "He's getting big." No hug, no warmth, just polite small talk before she gracefully returned to her spotlight. Judith, my mother, didn't acknowledge me at all. She walked past me as if I were one of the anonymous catering staff. But Luca was glowing. He thought the elaborate chandelier looked like a spaceship, and he whispered that Vivian looked like a real-life princess. When I saw how genuinely happy he was just being there, I decided to stay for the reception, even though I could feel that familiar unwelcome ache of not belonging settling in my chest. I found our table 9, tucked away near the back, conveniently close to the restrooms. I chuckled humorlessly to myself. How fitting. We ate our salads. I patiently helped Luca with his tie when he inevitably got chocolate mousse on it. I meticulously avoided eye contact with my mother and tried desperately to tune out the whispers of my name that drifted across the clinking glasses. Then the speeches began, and a cold dread settled over me. I realized this night wasn't going to be about family unity or tearful forgiveness. It was going to be yet another stage for Vivian to shine, and I, her older sister, was about to become her cruel punchline. It started the way most wedding speeches do, warm, sugary, just a touch over-rehearsed. Vivian stood up with impeccable posture, a champagne flute held delicately in her freshly manicured hand. Her dress shimmered under the reception lights, and the room instantly hushed in anticipation. She smiled, pausing just long enough for everyone to settle. "I want to thank all of you for being here." She began, her voice radiating happiness. "It's the happiest day of my life, and I'm surrounded by the people who mean everything to me." I watched from our back table, trying to convince myself that I was somehow included in that heartfelt sentiment. Luca was perched on the edge of his chair beside me, kicking his legs, completely enchanted by the fairy tale atmosphere. Vivian continued speaking sweetly about her new husband Callum, about love, perfect timing, and fate. I relaxed a little, daring to hope that maybe, just maybe, this speech wouldn't descend into something cruel. Then she shifted, a sly, knowing smile playing on her lips. "And of course," she said, her voice dripping with mock sincerity, "I want to give a shout-out to my big sister. You've always been such a strong example." The spotlight seemed to shift, and I could feel eyes turning toward me. I sat up a little straighter, offering a polite, somewhat strained smile. Vivian continued, her voice light, but undeniably pointed. "She's the bravest woman I know. She raised a child on her own, no husband, no partner, just her, and, well, whoever was kind enough to babysit." The room chuckled. My stomach tightened into a knot. But seriously? She added, her voice hardening almost imperceptibly. It's incredible how she's managed. A single mom unwanted by anyone but still showing up. Laughter. Real loud, unfiltered laughter. I felt the breath leave my body, a sudden crushing emptiness. My cheeks flushed a burning red, and my hands froze around the napkin in my lap. I glanced at Luca. He was frowning, confused, glancing around the room, as if trying to understand why people were laughing at his mom. Then came the absolute worst part. My mother, Judith, laughed louder than anyone. She leaned toward her table mates, her voice loud enough to carry across the room. She's a used product, she declared, her eyes glinting with malicious amusement. But she still polishes up well. Another wave of laughter this time, the kind that didn't even try to hide its cruelty. My vision blurred for a second. It felt like being slapped, except no one had touched me. Everyone just laughed around me as if it were perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable to mock a woman who had spent nearly a decade working herself to the bone to raise her son with dignity and warmth. As if being alone somehow made me less. I looked down at Luca. His innocent smile had vanished completely. He leaned into me, whispering, "Why did she say that? What does she mean?" I desperately wanted to answer to shield him, but I couldn't find the words. I couldn't protect him from this raw, painful moment. I couldn't shield him from the way our own family saw me. That kind of pain doesn't hide well. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm. I frantically scanned the room, searching for an exit for someone who might step in, someone who might simply say, "Enough," but no one did. Some people looked uncomfortable, their gazes shifting nervously, but they didn't speak. They just stared at their glasses, their plates, their phones. Even Grandpa Norman, who used to call me his little lion when I was a kid, meticulously avoided my gaze. He was physically there, but in that agonizing moment, he wasn't with me. I was alone again. The thing is, I could have taken it if it were just me. I've spent years swallowing that kind of degrading treatment. I could have forced a smile, taken Luca by the hand, and left quietly with my head held high. But seeing the profound confusion in my son's eyes, seeing him struggle to understand why the very people who were clapping and toasting were suddenly laughing at his mother, it cracked something open inside me. I stood up, not because I knew what I was going to say, and certainly not because I wanted to make a scene. I just needed to get out of that suffocating room. I needed air. I needed to breathe without choking on the shame they were so carelessly handing me. I pushed my chair back, my hands trembling uncontrollably. And then from the head table, another chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. Callum the groom stood up. He looked pale, his jaw tight. He took the microphone from Vivian without asking, without a word. The room went absolutely silent. It was as if the temperature had suddenly dropped. No more laughter, no more whispers, just this profound, unsettling stillness. And I knew with a chilling certainty that whatever came next was definitely not part of the plan. Callum stood, one hand still resting on the table, the other clutching the microphone. His eyes were locked on me, not on Vivian, not on Judith, not on the now silent crowd, but on me. For a second, I thought maybe he'd try to make another joke, smooth things over, say something charming to diffuse the unbearable tension. That's what people usually do in my family. They brush it under the rug, pretend it didn't happen, call it humor or tradition. But that's not what he did. He didn't smile. He didn't laugh. His face was tight with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher, anger perhaps, but deeper, like a potent mix of disappointment and utter disbelief. Before he could speak, I pushed my chair in and reached for Luca's hand. I was ready to leave quietly with whatever grace I had left. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry or break down. I'd done it before. I could do it again. But as I turned to step away, Callum's voice rang out low, firm, and undeniably calm. "Lara, don't go." That stopped me cold. Everyone in the room turned toward him. Whispers swept through the tables like a breeze through dry leaves. Vivian stiffened, her perfect composure cracking. Judith narrowed her eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line of displeasure. The DJ reached instinctively toward the volume controls, but stopped abruptly when Callum raised a hand. He didn't look at anyone but me. "I can't pretend I'm okay with what just happened," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "I won't stand up here and let that kind of cruelty pass as comedy." The room collectively held its breath. Callum stepped out from behind the head table and slowly walked forward. He wasn't rushing. Every step seemed deliberate, as if he were pushing through the palpable weight of the room's tension. He stopped near our table, me, Luca, the now cold salad plates, and looked directly at the guests. "I've heard a lot about family over the past year while planning this wedding," he stated, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "About appearances, tradition, loyalty. But what I just saw wasn't family. That was mockery dressed up as celebration." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some people glanced nervously at Judith. Others stared intently into their drinks. But no one spoke. He then turned to Vivian, his gaze unwavering. You mocked your sister for being a single mother for raising a child without help. You laughed, and worse, you made her son watch it happen. Vivian opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Callum didn't wait for her to answer. She didn't ask to be put in that position, but she did it. She showed up today. She sat in the back. She smiled. She brought her son to witness your big day. And you turned that into a joke. I had never in all my life seen Vivian look small until that very moment. Callum turned again to the room, his voice unwavering. Laura didn't stand here to defend herself. She didn't ask for sympathy. She's never needed a stage. But I won't stay silent, because if I'm about to marry into a family that sees cruelty as humor and shame as tradition, then I need to reconsider what kind of man I want to be. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. A woman at the next table whispered, "Is this real?" Someone dropped a fork, the clatter echoing in the stunned silence. Luca looked up at me with wide, bewildered eyes. I didn't know what to do. I'd come here expecting to simply survive the evening. I certainly didn't expect to be defended, not like this, not in front of everyone. Callum looked down at my son and gave him the softest, most reassuring nod. Your mom's the strongest person in this room, son. Don't you ever forget that. He turned back to the crowd one last time, his gaze sweeping over their stunned faces. I think I've seen enough. With that, he calmly set the microphone down, walked past Vivian without another glance, and headed straight out the door. I stood there utterly frozen, still holding Luca's hand. The music didn't start. The crowd didn't move. It was as if someone had drained all the air out of the room. The fairy tale had shattered, but for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't the one left broken. The reckoning and reclaiming dignity. The moment Callum walked out of the reception hall, it was like someone had flipped a switch. No one clapped. No one cheered. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant clink of a single spoon hitting a glass. The crowd was frozen, their eyes darting nervously between me, Vivian, and the door Callum had just disappeared through. Vivian stood at the head table like she'd just been physically slapped. Her perfect posture cracked her shoulders, visibly sagging under the immense weight of what had just happened. She looked around, but the faces staring back at her weren't smiling anymore. Some looked utterly shocked. Some looked deeply embarrassed. A few even looked outright angry, not at Callum, but at her. Judith was the first to speak. She stood abruptly, her chair screeching back across the polished floor, the sound jarring in the silence. What an ungrateful boy, she snapped, her voice laced with venom. He embarrassed you in front of everyone. Typical, just like your sister selfish. But her voice didn't carry like it usually did. The power she held over the room had vanished. Her words fell flat, hollow. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. For the very first time in my life, I didn't feel like shrinking under her voice. I turned to Luca. He looked up at me, still unsure, his little hand gripping mine tighter. Are we leaving? He asked quietly. Yes, baby, I said, brushing his hair back gently, a small, genuine smile gracing my lips. We're going home. I stood tall as I took his hand and began walking toward the exit. People parted as I passed like a silent, understanding sea. Some avoided my eyes, their gazes fixed on the floor. Others looked as if they wanted to say something, anything, but couldn't find the words. Halfway to the door, I heard someone call my name. Laura! I turned. It was my grandfather, Norman. His pale eyes rimmed red with unshed tears. He stood slowly and took a hesitant step toward me. I'm sorry, he said, his voice soft, shaky, filled with regret. I should have stopped it years ago. I simply nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I didn't hate him for not defending me. I understood intimately what silence costs some people. I'd lived it. I wasn't angry, but I wasn't carrying their guilt anymore either. Outside, the air was cool and crisp, a welcome balm. Luca squeezed my hand. Is the wedding over? He asked, his voice filled with a child's simple curiosity. Yeah, I said, smiling down at him. I think it ended exactly how it needed to. We drove home in comfortable silence, the radio off, just the gentle hum of the tires on the asphalt, and the soft rhythm of Luca tapping his fingers on the armrest. I tucked him in that night, kissed his forehead, and lingered by his door a little longer than usual. He didn't ask any more questions. He didn't need to. The next morning, I woke up to a dozen missed calls from unknown numbers, distant cousins. Even a couple of guests I barely knew. I ignored them all. My phone buzzed again, a text from a friend who had been at the wedding. Someone recorded Callum's speech. It's on Facebook, over 50,000 views already. You need to see the comments, people are standing up for you. I opened the video. There it was. Callum's voice calm and direct, standing up to an entire room. And there I was, frozen in the frame, holding Luca's hand, a silent witness. The comments were overflowing with support. This man is a hero. She deserved better. I'm crying watching this. Every single mom out there just got a little bit of justice. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just felt still.
like something that had been clenching inside me for years had finally mercifully let go.
That week, Vivian tried desperately to spin the story. She claimed Callum had overreacted, that it was just a joke, that people were too sensitive. But the truth had already landed resounding and clear, and no one was laughing anymore. A few days later, a small, unassuming bouquet of wildflowers showed up at my apartment. No note, just a little card that simply read, "To the Lioness." I didn't need to ask who it was from. The wedding, in its traditional sense, didn't happen, but something far more important did. For once, I wasn't the one carrying the shame. I wasn't the one who had to apologize. I walked out of that room with my son, my dignity firmly intact, and my head held high. And somewhere out there, someone, a surprising ally, reminded a room full of people, and maybe even the whole internet, what it truly means to be strong. A new chapter. It's been 6 months since the wedding that never happened. Vivian and Callum officially called off the engagement. There was no grand statement, no public drama, no follow-up posts. Just a quiet, undeniable erasure of what was supposed to be a perfect day. Vivian returned to her social circle as if nothing had happened. The pictures from that night disappeared from her feed. She hasn't reached out to me, and frankly, I'm not sure I expected her to. Judith called once, not to apologize, of course, but to chastise me for embarrassing the family by not laughing along. I listened for exactly 30 seconds, then told her something I never thought I'd have the strength to say. "I'm not your scapegoat anymore." Then I hung up. It wasn't angry, it wasn't dramatic. It was clean, simple, and utterly final. I realized after everything that I didn't need a grand apology from my family. I didn't need them to suddenly change or recognize my worth. I just needed to stop waiting for their permission to see it in myself. My life didn't transform overnight into a fairy tale. I still work long hours. I still make 2 separate dinners some nights because Luca wants pancakes and I want something green. But I carry myself differently now. I'm not hunched under years of quiet shame. I don't hide in the back of rooms anymore. Luca's changed too. He asks more questions now, smart ones. He wants to know why some people are cruel and why others are brave. He talks about Callum like he's a Marvel hero. Sometimes he pretends to give speeches with his action figures standing up for the little guy. I watch him and I know deep in my bones that he saw something that night that will profoundly shape the kind of man he'll become, strong, gentle, unafraid to speak when it counts. One night while we were brushing our teeth, Luca looked up at me in the mirror and asked, "Mom, are you still sad about what Aunt Vivian said?" I paused, then said, "Not anymore. Why?" He shrugged a smudge of toothpaste on his chin. "Because I think you won, even though it wasn't a fight." That stayed with me because he was right. I didn't yell. I didn't insult anyone back. I didn't demand justice or cry in public or make a scene. I simply stood up, held my son's hand, and walked away. And someone else, someone utterly unexpected, decided that silence wasn't good enough anymore. Callum didn't just stand up for me. He reminded everyone in that room what love actually looks like. Not the kind that wears a tuxedo or walks down the aisle, but the kind that sees someone being hurt and says, "No, not today." If I've learned anything from all of this, it's this: being alone doesn't mean you're unwanted. Being kind doesn't make you weak. And dignity once reclaimed is something no one can ever take from you again. So no, I didn't dance at my sister's wedding. I didn't toast or toss a bouquet or cry happy tears under twinkling fairy lights. But I did leave with something infinitely better than approval. I left with my head held high, my son beside me, and the deep, quiet certainty that I no longer need to explain myself to anyone. That is the ending no one expected, and exactly the one I deserved. If this story moved you, if you've ever been made to feel small or silenced in a room full of people who should have stood by you, know this. Your voice matters, your dignity matters, and you are not alone. If you found strength in this story, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. I'd love to know. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone finally stood up for you, or where you had to bravely stand up for yourself? And if you want more true stories that cut deep, challenge expectations, and remind us what it truly means to be human, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for being here.